Be aware that the initial question I asked Chieftain is quite different to the title of the video. Yet as you will see in the video, it leads basically to the same answer. Hello everyone, we are today here with the Chieftain, and I have a question for you, which is rather naive probably, but I actually don't really know the answer to it. What it is with the main battle tank? Because it came up somewhere in the Cold War, but some people claim the Panther was already a main battle tank, some other people claim the other thing. So what is it with the main battle tank? Because I look at it and I say, yeah, that's a universal tank, but we also had this, in my opinion, in the Second World War. I know that after the Cold War, basically they got rid of heavy tanks.
Yeah.
So is basically a main battle tank just a medium tank, but also some people argue that main battle tanks are now as heavy, so that is the question, did they get rid of the
Did they get rid of the medium tank?
Medium tank? But where does the whole... And by the way, for those people, I know that the IS-2 as a heavy tank served until the 1990s, but I'm talking about new built ones. Yeah. So what is the whole thing with the main battle tank stuff? What was it about?
Was it just a buzzword? I don't know if I've seen an official doctrinal distinguisher, because if you look at the front page of the manual of an M1, it doesn't say main battle tank. It says tank, one full tracked 120mm main gun, General Abrams. Okay. M1A1, whatever. It doesn't say MBT in it.
It also makes no medium or something else. Because, for instance, for contrast, I know that the NVA, the Nationale Volksarmee, from the GDR, from the German Democratic Republic, they had I have manuals from them from the 1970s for handbook for the medium tank crewmen. Yeah. So they have, because they have the IS-2s, for instance, which are still heavy.
No, and if you look at the manual for a tank platoon, the current US doctrinal manual, it doesn't say medium tank, main battle tank, it just says tank, period. Was Panther the first tank? Well, so that's, here I have, it's not a video, I got Steve Zaluga, Hilary Doyle, Ken Estes, David Fletcher, all the big names in tank, and the question came up, what was the first MBT? And none of them wanted to give an answer, until finally Zaluga says Panther. And I don't think he's wrong.
But what makes a main battle tank? But that's for me the question. Because if I look at the Panther and I look at the Panther IV, well, the Panther has a longer gun and it has way more frontal armor and way less side armor in comparison, I think. So the frontal armor is really strong and the side armor is rather weak on that. Whereas the Panther IV, it's more on the front, but not that much.
But the Panther was also pretty good at doing the same job as Tiger. If your job requires taking hits whilst killing things, Panther wasn't bad.
So it's basically about having more armor.
So let's look at a different one. So look at the two tanks that people say were the first MBTs. That's slightly less controversial than Panther. People say Centurion, or they will say T-55, T-54. They were developed as a cruiser tank and as a medium tank, and only later were they redesignated. So when the tanks were built, nobody had this idea in mind, we are going to make an MBT. They just built the best cruiser and medium tank that they could, which turned out to be so good that it made the necessity of heavy tanks perhaps obsolete.
So a main battle tank is qualified by heavy armor at the front and ability to kill nearly every other enemy tank.
Correct. And that's why Conqueror didn't last for particularly long, because Conqueror had that great big 120mm gun, but then that was designed to go with
Conqueror was the British heavy tank,
like the M103. That was designed to go alongside the British Centurion with a 20 pounder. M103 had a 120mm gun. The tank that it fought alongside had a 90mm gun. But by the time you get to the British L7, what is a masterpiece of a gun, all of a sudden that can kill basically anything that the 120 can. Why do you need it? Or Chieftain comes out with a 120 gun and it replaces Centurion, but it's got as good a gun, if not a better gun than Conqueror. There's no need to have that heavy tank. So it will take the hits from pretty much anything out there. It will kill pretty much anything out there. which is your heavy tank characteristic, but it is mobile enough and sustainable enough to perform the vast majority of battlefield operations at the largest scale that you need to perform, thus obviating the need for a lighter tank to do those jobs. Now, there are some parts of terrain where you need a light tank, up the Himalayan mountains or something, you need a light tank, or some of the islands in Japan. But the MBT can do the jobs of heavy and medium tanks, and to an extent, some of the light tank functions of reconnaissance. So if you look at the organization of, let's say, late Cold War reconnaissance units, you will see, and both the Germans, the Americans, and the Soviets, you would combine IFVs and recon vehicles with a couple of tanks here and there for the recon and counter-recon roles. Now, the British kind of never really got with that. The British always kept, our recon is purely for sneaking around and we're not going to shoot anything, which is a little bit optimistic, swing fire strikers notwithstanding. But if the tank is now performing roles in reconnaissance units and the main maneuver units and what are effectively the breakthrough units, you now have a main battle tank. And I think that it became the way it was used, not the way it was designed. It was, if the tank was designed well enough that it could be used in all these different ways, it was a main battle tank.
So basically a bit like the Sturm, it was not designed as a tank destroyer, but it became one eventually.
Yeah, it was just, let's build the best medium tank we can, and all of a sudden they have improvements in particularly engine technology, which means you can have a much more powerful engine, which means you can have a much more armored vehicle while still maintaining that mobility, plus improvements in armor design and so on. That the medium tank just evolved and became the MBT. Nobody sat down and said, I want to design an MBT. It's just, I want to design the best damn tank I can, as mobile as possible, as armored as possible, and as armed as possible.
Now I get the point about the Panther being the first main battle tank. Okay. The funny thing is, I didn't wrote that question down. It came up in the last discussion basically, but I had the other question: why heavy armor disappeared basically after the second World War. So we answered that as well. So I might rename this video depending on how I feel about it, which goes better. So basically why we also answered that question completely, why heavy armor was gone after the second World War. Shortly while after.
Yeah, it was not needed anymore.
Yeah. So,
I mean, look, what was the heaviest tank built? It was Conqueror was heavier than M1. It was like 70 tons.
And who came up with the word main battle tank then?
I have absolutely no idea.
And when did it come up, more or less?
I would think the 60s, maybe. Again, because it's not actually a doctrinal term, I don't recall ever seeing it in any official manuals. I think it's a term of convenience. Much like tank destroyer is a term of convenience. I mean, what's it like? The Centauro B2. It's an 8x8 tank destroyer with a 120mm gun. I don't know if it is actually officially called a tank destroyer in Italian doctrine, or is it simply?
But the Americans used tank destroyer, right?
The Americans used tank destroyer, but that wasn't a design of vehicle. That was a doctrine. So a tank destroyer could be a towed 3-inch gun, or it could be a truck with a 37mm on it, or it could be a tracked vehicle,
Yeah, the Germans in the late war, they finally distinguished between the Panzerjäger and the Jagdpanzer.
Yeah, so there's two different definitions as a tank destroyer. There's the American World War II definition, which was the role, which arguably is the attack helicopter battalion today, which was the same thing, designed to sling a lot of anti-tank weapons, go somewhere quickly, sling a lot of anti-tank weapons, then go somewhere else. That's a World War II tank destroyer unit. But a modern tank destroyer like an ITV or a BRDM2 with like 8 missiles on the top, I think we just call them tank destroyers because of convenience. It gets the concept of what it does without necessarily saying it is a maneuver combat vehicle. Well, I argue that is actually more of a wheeled tank than a tank destroyer, or any other thing that we have that is used as a tank destroyer, we just don't call it one.
I mean, that's generally very interesting and something we should probably add, that some of these terms changed over time and are very convenient. For instance, the Germans before the war defined medium, light and heavy tank solely on the size of the gun.
They weren't alone. I think the Americans did the same. Heavy gun tank, medium gun tank.
Could be, but they call it specifically, they call it light, medium and heavy. And not with the gun was the determining factor, but not in the name. And I remember I talked with David Willey shortly about this on Tankfest, but we had no time for an interview or anything. And he said also that the British had very different concept, what we nowadays think of a light, medium and heavy tank. But so that was really interesting. And by the way, this is also why I have a video why basically the Tiger by the 1930s definition, and I think it was mid-30s, would be actually a medium tank.
So yeah, there's another question is like, what's an assault tank? What's a heavy tank? What's a breakthrough tank? So the terms breakthrough tank did not exist in American doctrine, but you had both assault tanks and heavy tanks. Well, what's the difference? Both of them are designed to wade into the thick of battle and take whatever comes at it. The only difference I've found between a heavy tank like the M6 and the assault tank like the Jumbo or the T-14 is the gun. The M6 heavy tank, and you read it again in the archives of the discussions are going on, what did Devers think, for example, of it. He's always talking about the gun. Is the power of the gun on this heavy tank worth the limitations in mobility and transportation and so on? He doesn't say that the armor is necessarily a bonus. He just looks at it as this makes the tank heavier. He's talking about the gun. But when we finally do get something put into service, the assault tank M4A3E2, the Jumbo, that's all about the armor. And they stick a 75mm gun on it, and they're quite happy. The T-14 assault tank that was for the British requirement. It's like a big supersized Sherman with the same 75mm gun.
Okay.
So that's the American perspective. Now, I don't claim to know what the British or the Germans, how they categorize it per se, but I just found it interesting that you had, is Jumbo a heavy tank? No, it's an assault tank. Whereas the M6 was not an assault tank, it was a heavy tank.
The M6 is the Dreadnought, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was ever called that, but common term.
We move to that next.
We move to that next, okay. Different video?
Okay, then thank you very much. Thank you for watching and see you next time, bye.